Hey, thank you so much for joining us at our Crosspoint Church podcast. Now, if you're new to our podcast or maybe new to our church in general, we're just a bunch of messed up people who don't have it all together, running after a heavenly leader who loves us and meets us right where we are. We hope this message encourages you, builds your faith, and strengthens your confidence as you continue down this journey of what it means to know and follow Jesus. Enjoy this message.
Yeah, that begs the question, who are you following? That's a question we're going to be answering because we're all following someone. And another way to say that is, who are you, everyone is a disciple, who are you discipling after? Because the question isn't, are you a disciple? It's like you actually are. You actually are following someone or something. And the bigger question is that thing actually bringing you life, more hope, more goodness, more joy to your life? And so I think that's something we all want. I think that's something we all are going after. And yet the problem is we don't always know how to get there because no one has shown us how to do that. So that's what we're going to be going after and exploring over these next 7 weeks, and I think it's going to be amazing. So this is a kickoff week of the Practicing the Way journey. Give yourselves a hand for being here this weekend. Man, so excited to have you with us. Welcome to Crosspoint. My name's Curt, and if you're here for the first time, really excited to have you with us this weekend. It's a great time to be joining us because you can decide, hey, I may want to just try this next 7 weeks and see what God does in my life. Now, we got a whole bunch of people join us online. Let's make some noise for those in our online space this weekend. So excited to have you join us. And we see you. We want you to know you are very much with us this weekend. Now, I want to start off by talking about Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was a lot of things. He was Messiah. He was the Son of God. And he also was a first century Jew. And if you were to go to synagogue and Jesus were to show up, he probably would be teaching. And people would actually refer to him as a rabbi. And another word for rabbi is actually teacher. And so Jesus would kind of make his way all throughout the countryside, and he had this thing called a yoke. And the yoke was his teaching. It was his way. It was his way of life. And so Jesus, that's what he did. He walked around teaching, carrying this yoke. He was this young, brilliant, kind of anti-establishment, anti-status quo rabbi in the north part of Israel in the first century. Now, when you look throughout the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see 90 different times someone comes up to Jesus, addresses him, talks to him. 60 of those times, they actually call him rabbi or teacher. Now, this has huge implications for us in terms of what it looks like for you and I to actually follow him. And so regardless of where you are in your spiritual journey, we really think you're going to get something out of this, whether you're starting, whether you've been tracking for a while, whether you're stuck, whether you're looking to go to the new place. In fact, that's one of the reasons we're here. We have this thing we show periodically when we connect with people, do things like Explore Crosspoint. We say, hey, we're here to help you in your journey. It's actually your journey. And there's kind of a process that we want to help you identify. And you might just look at this image here and try to figure out, okay, where am I in this process? Some of us are seekers. In fact, we're all seekers, in fact. We're all seeking after something, looking for something. When we take the step to receive God, we actually become a receiver of his grace. And that means we begin relationship with God. That actually means you're going to heaven. But the good and the bad is you got eternity with God, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything in the here and now changes all that much, because that begins to happen when we begin to follow, when we become followers of Jesus, which is kind of the next phase. And this phase can take years. In fact, it's pretty much most of our lifetime. And eventually we get into this aspect where we have this radical generosity and we live this sacrificial life. And so, wherever you're at in that spectrum, I just want you to know, I think God's going to meet you right there this weekend. And as we start this journey, now this whole idea of being a follower of Jesus, I think it's a bit cliche. I think sometimes we throw it around. I don't know that we fully know what it means. So I want to kind of look at a few stories from the life of Jesus as we start and kind of get a picture of what it looks like for him to be a rabbi and what he does when he invites people to follow him. So here's the first one. This is the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. It says, and Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once, they left their nets, and what did they do right here? They followed him. Next, it says, when he had gone a little further, he saw James and John, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat. They were preparing their nets, and without delay, Jesus called them, and they literally left their father and their business and the boat with the hired men, and what did they do right there? They followed him. If you flip over to the next chapter in the book of Mark, it says, once again, Jesus was out beside the lake. A large crowd came and gathered around him, and he began to teach them because he was a rabbi, he was a teacher. And as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi, he got up, and what did he do? He followed him. And then one more version right here, and this is one that's a little more of a popular, one of more Jesus' more popular stories. It says, then he called to the crowd, and the crowd came to him along with his disciples, and he said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross, and," here's our word again, "follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul?" Now, I don't know if you see a pattern right here. I mean, in story after story, we look at these moments where we see Jesus, and he's not saying, "Hey, everybody come, believe in me so you can get to heaven one day," or, when you die or whatever. I mean, it's never really his message. The call of Jesus was pretty straightforward. He said, "Hey, I want you to come and follow me. I want you to come and be my disciple." Now, this word disciple is actually the word talmudin, which can be translated into student or learner or follower. And we think about this word, don't think as followers like we think about it today, like, "Hey, I'm going to follow you on Instagram, Jesus. I'm going to give you some likes. I'm going to give you some hearts. I'm going to love your pictures." It's not that. As we think about being a student, it's also not, this idea of like, "Hey, it's my freshman year at BSU or IU or PU or BU, wherever your kids are at. I'm going to go do some homework. I'm going to study a little bit." It was actually way, way deeper than that. In fact, the English word to kind of capture what it meant to follow is the word apprentice. And so this word takes on an entirely different meaning. In fact, it has to do with following at a different level, discipling yourself after someone. But what's kind of crazy is Jesus actually didn't invent this word. In fact, discipleship didn't even start with Jesus. It actually started in Greece. In fact, we have, guys like Plato, for instance, he was a disciple of Socrates. And that was just a common thing in the first century. That made its way across the Mediterranean and became a normal part of the vernacular in the first century world. So I want to kind of nerd out on us for a bit on what this looked like, because one of the things I've discovered is I've come to realize that these stories we're looking at make way more sense when we understand the background going on behind them. So we know Jesus was a Jewish rabbi. He had Jewish disciples. He lived in a first century Jewish community. People in that area believed that God had revealed himself to a guy named Moses, given him the first 4 books of what we know as the Old Testament called the Torah. And the Torah was kind of the center of foundation for everybody's lives. Everybody centered around these 5 books, and even the educational system at the time. In fact, there were 3 levels of education that kids would go through. In fact, the first educational level was what's called Bates Affair. Now, most boys and girls would go to Bates Affair. They'd begin when they were 5 or 6 years old, much like our children start, at 5, 6 years old, they begin to go to school. And they would basically learn the Torah, and then through the Torah, they would learn simple things like mathematics and language. But get this, they would memorize the first 5 books of the Old Testament known as the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Memorize. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, some of you are going, "Wow, that's why my kids are so messed up," because they're not doing that right there, right? So most kids, by the time they would get through this first level of education, they'd hit about 10, maybe 12 years old, and that was about the time they were done. And in fact, if you were a female, you would actually go out and you would get married. You begin bearing children, maybe at the age of 13 or 14. And I know, listen, we have a ways to go in terms of women's rights today, but listen, we have made a lot of progress over the last number of centuries, right? I mean, think about that. Wow, 13, 14 years old, girls going out and bearing children. So we still have more progress to make, but we're making progress. And if you were male, you would basically go and you would learn the family business. You would learn the family trade. But if you were the best of the best, you would be invited to the next level of education, which was Beit Talmud. And this was known as the house of learning. In fact, there was literally a house attached to the synagogue. And these students, somewhere between the ages of 10 and 14, they would show up, they'd go to this classroom, and they would have a paid teacher. And they would memorize, get this, all of the Old Testament. All right, think about this. I mean, some of us, if you've ever read the New Testament in like a reading plan, it took you like 6 months, right? Like 8 months. They would memorize it. Look at this, Genesis to Malachi memorized. Now, just remember, if you're feeling a little down on yourself. They were an oral culture, all right? So just remind yourself when you're like, boy, loser me, can't even read the Old Testament, let alone memorize it. This was very normal. They were an oral culture at the time, but they would memorize Genesis to Malachi. And at that point, most students were done. But if you were the best of the best of the best, I mean, if you were like summa cum laude, I mean, if you were like the elite, then they'd go on to the third level of education called Beit Midrash. And this is where you would begin to apprentice. This is where you would apprentice under a rabbi. And let me just say, this was like over the top hard to even apply for. In fact, you got invited into this, and if you did, you would sit and you would be interviewed by the rabbi, and he'd grill you and he'd interrogate you. He'd want to know if you knew the Torah inside and out, if you knew every word of the entire Old Testament as we know it, because he wanted to see if you had the smarts, if you had the acumen, if you had the work ethic, and if you had the drive. And if you felt like you had it, he would say to you, hey, I want you to come follow me. I want you to be my disciple. Now, let's just say that happened for you. All right, let's just say, I mean, and listen, the odds are against you, all right? But let's just say that you made it to that level. You had 3 goals that you were going to accomplish if you got to that place. Your first goal was to be with your rabbi. All right, in fact, we read this line a moment ago where it said that they might be with him. All right, and so apprenticing was 24/7. I mean, it wasn't like being a student today where you go to class Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I mean, this was like 24/7 with your rabbi. I mean, you're eating meals with your rabbi. You're walking next to your rabbi. You're even sleeping in the room right next to your rabbi. And there was this well-known Hebrew blessing in the first century that people would say something like this. They would say, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. Now, understand, they were in like a desert culture. Roads weren't paved except in the city, so they were walking around in dust every day. But this was not a metaphor, right? At the end of the day, I mean, that was like a goal. That was like, you are good, you're hope, you are lucky, you're blessed if somebody might say, hey, you look like you are covered in the dust of your rabbi. So that was one of your goals, to be with your rabbi. The second goal that you would have was to be like your rabbi. Now, this is a bit difficult for us to understand because, see, in modern day America today, we say things like, hey, you go be you, you be yourself, you're snowflake, you're like one in a million. I mean, you're unique, there's nobody else like you, which is absolutely true. All that stuff's absolutely true. But in Jesus' day, in first century Nazareth, it wasn't like that at all. If you were following a rabbi, you wanted to be a carbon copy of your rabbi. I mean, you wanted to imitate his every move. You wanted to copy the tone of his voice, the dialect of his speech. You wanted to look like him, dress like him, have mannerisms like him. Your goal was to be like your rabbi. So you want to be with your rabbi, you want to be like your rabbi, and then your third goal was you wanted to do what he did. Now, I want to share another story with us here that gives us a little picture of why and what this looked like to do what your rabbi did. This was a moment where Jesus was out and he was praying, and he sent his team across a lake. And a storm moved in and it got kind of rough. And Jesus, you may have heard this story before, begins to walk out on the water toward his team. And here's what it says. It says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. A short time before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake, and they were terrified because who wouldn't be, right? They thought he was a ghost. But immediately he said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter said, tell me to come out to you on the water. Jesus looked at him, he said, come on out, Peter. And Peter got down out of the boat, he walked on the water toward Jesus, but he saw the wind and he was afraid and he began to sink and he cried out, Lord, save me. Now, you might say, why would Peter do that? Well, Jesus is like, hey, you're up to bat. Peter was like, hey, I see you doing something. If I'm orienting my life around you, I just want to do what you're doing. Because the whole point of apprenticeship was that you would do literally what your rabbi was doing. So history lesson over right there. This is what it meant to be a rabbi back in the first century. So the question I want us to dig into as we kick off this journey is, what does that look like today? All right, if we kind of flip this and say, okay, here in 2025, Fishers, Indiana, north side of Indy, 2025, what does it look like to follow Jesus, to apprentice Jesus in a way that actually begins to change us, begins to transform us? And if you're going to do this, in fact, you're going to have kind of the same three goals that rabbis had back in the first century. All right, and so this is a moment where if you're taking notes, you might want to screenshot these. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to be with Jesus. In fact, I would even argue this isn't just the first thing that we want to do. I would argue this is the most important thing if we want to grow in becoming more like Jesus. We spend every waking moment tracking with Jesus, thinking about Jesus, thinking about what he would do in this moment. In fact, Thomas à Kempis, he called this a familiar friendship with Jesus. In fact, Jesus even called us friends. I mean, there was a moment where Jesus said to his apprentices, he says, I have called you friends. And so the idea here is that we begin a friendship with Jesus and we enter into relationship literally with God himself. I mean, this Trinitarian community, think about this, where we begin to befriend Jesus and Jesus befriends us, and we're enveloped into the love and the goodness and the hope of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit, and we live in this connection all day long. Jesus actually has a word for this. He calls it abiding. In fact, a pastor from earlier last century, a guy by the name of A.W. Tozer, he called this the constant conscious communion. In fact, I love what Brother Lawrence calls it, a French friar in the Catholic Church. He said, this is practicing the presence of God. This idea that we can be in constant connection with Jesus. But he says it's going to take practice. This week, we're actually going to carve out some time. In fact, you're going to have a moment, which we'll explain here in a bit, to spend some time just spending some time and being intentional and trying to make some time in the morning or in the evening or finding some touch points during the day where you can actually connect with God. In fact, I love what Dallas Willard says about this. Dallas Willard's like one of the foremost formational guys on the inner spiritual life over the last century. He said this. He said, the first and most basic thing we can and must do to keep God before our minds, this is fundamental, the secret of caring for our souls. Our part in this practicing the presence of God is to direct and redirect our minds constantly to him. In the early time of our practicing, we may well be challenged by our burdensome habits of dwelling on things less than God. I have a problem with that right there. I don't know if you do, but he's being very gracious because I started focusing on God. I immediately get distracted and start thinking on things not of God. But here's what he says. He says, but these are habits. He says, they're not like laws of gravity. They can be broken. And a new grace-filled habit will replace the former ones as we take intentional steps toward keeping God before us. And soon our minds begin to return to God as the needle of a compass constantly returns to the north. God is the great longing of our souls. He will become the pole star of our inward beings. So part of what we're going to be journeying on is how do we do more of that? How do we make God our true north and spend more and more time with him so that he can continue to draw us in the right direction? Now, there's some time-tested ways to remain in him. In fact, we're going to be going over some of those over the next few weeks. This abiding in Jesus, we're going to try to unpack what that looks like, where you can spend time throughout your day, throughout your week, even at different points in your life where you kind of take moments to slow down, where you breathe in and you breathe out. And you say, okay, God, you're here. Okay, I'm not here yet. All right, I'm in the carpool line. I'm in rush hour traffic. All right, I've been on email. I'm on Instagram right now. But God, you're here. I want to spend a little time with you. Okay, now I'm beginning to be here. I'm telling you, finding moments like that where we begin to slow down and connect with God, this is where the money is. In fact, this is one of the practices that you're going to have the opportunity to practice this week. In fact, when you came in this weekend, you got a guidebook like this. This is going to be your companion throughout the whole journey. For those of you tuning in online, there's a QR code right here, or you can go to the Journey website. You can download a digital version, and we encourage you to do that. I want you to turn to page 10 and 11, because here's what we're going to do this week. We're going to actually practice abiding or spending daily time in prayer with God this week. And so in order to do that, there's some prompts in your guide, and you're going to kind of be guided to do 4 things. Number 1, identify a quiet place this week. All right, and this is a place where you can focus, maybe a place that you can get a little peace around you. All right, and then the second thing is to identify a quiet time. Now, for many people, this is the first thing in the morning, like as soon as they wake up. For others, they do better at this at the end of the day. All right, for others yet, it might be like when your kids are napping. And so the goal is to try to give God your best time of the day where you have the most focus. And then the next step is going to be coming to quiet. All right, and this is a really important part of beginning to center ourselves and spend some time with God. So you might want to put your phone away if you're not using your device to do this journey. You might start with some big breaths where you inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, where you can begin to slow, where your body and your mind can begin to get space and you can begin to calm down. And you can let the things that you've been running after all day begin to dissipate. And then the fourth step is opening our heart to God in prayer. Now, I'm going to encourage you to practice this 2, 3, maybe even 4 times this week. As you get into your practice and just see what this time does. I'm going to be honest, for some of us, this is going to be a little unfamiliar, all right? Because you may not even know where to begin. And so in your guide, in your journey guide, there's some Psalms. In fact, the ancient leaders of the last number of centuries have always turned to Psalms to start their prayer time. And so you might want to read one of the Psalms as just a way to begin to talk to God. You might just want to sit in quietness. You might just want to sit and allow God to begin to speak to you or to reveal to you or to bring thoughts to your mind. And that might seem a little daunting, but it's amazing what happens when we begin to quiet ourselves. And then you're going to spend a little time reflecting on that. Now, this was a fascinating conversation. If that sounds a little odd to you, a couple years ago, when Mother Teresa, we call her Mama T in our house, Mother Teresa. You guys know Mama T, Mother Teresa? Just an amazing one. I don't know that there's anybody in the world that's ever been closer to the heart of God than Mother Teresa. Dan Rather interviewed her on the CBS Evening News, and here's how the conversation went. Dan said, hey, when you pray, Mother Teresa, what do you say to God? And Mother Teresa said, well, I don't say anything, I listen. So Dan said, okay, then when God speaks to you, then what does he say? And Mother Teresa said, well, he doesn't say anything, he listens. And if you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you. It's like almost like there's a supernatural thing. She's like, I don't say anything, I listen. And what does God say? Well, he actually listens to me. There's something that begins to happen in our souls and in our spirits when we quiet ourselves before God. We're going to have the chance to do that this week. And you're going to have the chance to reflect and see what that does for your spirit. You might want to spend an hour on it. You might want to spend 5 minutes on it. Anywhere in between, wherever you feel comfortable, is a good place to start. So that's being with Jesus. The second goal that we have is to become like Jesus. Now, this isn't anything new for us. We've actually do this all the time. In fact, if you grew up in the 80s, you probably remember always trying to be like someone. Make some noise if you ever tried to be like Mike on the driveway of your house. That was me. I remember being out there. I'm trying to do all the things. I couldn't do it, but we longed to be like Mike, right? We wanted to be able to do that. You probably have somebody in your life that you admire, that you want to be exactly like them, all right? This is not necessarily a spiritual thing, but in the spiritual sense, the kind of insider lingo on this, when we try to be like someone, is actually called spiritual formation. In fact, here's a good definition for spiritual formation. It's a process which means it doesn't happen right away. All right, this like takes time. It's like a long, drawn out, over many years process, a process where our spirit is formed to be like Jesus himself. Now I want you to imagine what your life might look like right now if Jesus were more and more expressed through your personality. Just think about that for a moment. Imagine what it would be like for you to be more loving or to be more peaceful or to be more joyful or to be more kind or more patient, to be more like Jesus. I mean, to become the kind of person where it's easier to love my enemy than to hate them or to kill them or to, gossip about them. It's easier to do hard better. It's easier to experience joy even when circumstances don't necessarily go the way that I expect. When it's easier to kind of be the kind of person where it's easier to trust God. Where, I don't know, when you get to the end of your month and you got way more bills than you do money, it's like, okay, I'm not going to let anxiety creep in right there. Well, imagine what that might be like. The New Testament writers, ancient theologians call this transformation. And that's something we're going to be going after over these 7 weeks. Now, the final goal of what it means for us to apprentice under Jesus in 2025, not only are we going to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, but it's to do what he does. To do what he does. Now, the whole goal of Jesus apprenticing was to teach what he did to those who were following. And Jesus is saying, hey, I want you to do what you do. If you think of someone who, say, goes to apprentice a plumber, that apprentice, their goal is not just to learn plumbing and to know the vernacular of plumbing. No, they actually want to be able to plumb a house. And this is where it gets a bit tricky with Jesus because, see, Jesus was a rabbi, but he was way more than a rabbi, right? He was the Son of God. He was the Messiah. But Jesus' daily work is about building and establishing and showing people what it's like to be a part of the kingdom of God. And so one of the goals of our apprenticing is that it isn't about just knowing about Jesus, but how do we do the things that he did? And I want to show you some of the things that he did. I mean, there's a pretty clear list, 8 or 9 things that he did. Things like sharing the good news, helping other people see that, hey, there's a really good thing that Jesus came to do for us. Teaching, healing, serving, many of you do that. Eating and drinking with people far from God. Doing justice, standing in for people who don't have one standing in on their behalf. Peacemaking, things like praying. I mean, these things might sound impossible to you, but when you are with Jesus and you spend time with Jesus, and it doesn't just happen in one day, over time, you will naturally find yourself doing and saying the kinds of things that Jesus said and Jesus did. So those are our goals over the next 7 weeks. What does it mean to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to do what he did? This is what it means when we say we're going to be practicing the way of Jesus. Now, some of you are going, well, Curt, like, how do I do that? Like, do I have to go out and like quit my job and like become a pastor like you and sit under a tree and read the Bible all day? Which I don't do that, by the way. Some people are like, what do you do all day? Do you just like sit around and read the Bible? I don't do that all day. Actually, I do a lot of things like you do in your work day. So I have to find times to do this as well. No, you don't have to become a pastor. You don't have to, start a nonprofit. You can follow Jesus as an investment banker. You can follow Jesus as a teacher. All right, you can learn to follow Jesus as an attorney, as a doctor, as a full-time parent, as a real estate agent, an architect. Whatever your thing is, the goal is, okay, in those moments, in my private life and my public life, how do I apprentice myself more and more around the person of Jesus? And see, that's the invitation right there. And that's not just like my invitation. In fact, that is Jesus' invitation. Now, I want us to notice a couple things before we kind of go and wrap up here, because there's a few things that kind of stand out in terms of what Jesus is calling us to. Number one, I want you to notice that the invitation of Jesus is to become an apprentice, not a Christian. In fact, did you realize that the word Christian was only like listed 3 times in the entire New Testament? And a couple times, in fact, it's actually a derogatory term, but the word follower or disciple is used 280 times. And so you go, okay, well, what's the difference between a Christian and a disciple? I mean, honestly, to a bit, it's semantics, all right? But for us in the U.S., I think in our Western American faith posture, I think the word Christian means things like, I basically assent to Christianity. I think it means things like, hey, I go to church every now and then, like Christmas, Easter, at Crosspoint Game Day, the 3rd holiday of the year. We hit the big ones. You're a semi-moral person. It means I'm not Muslim, I'm not Hindu, all right, or any other things. I'm Christian. Being Christian in the West, I think, is more about us wanting Jesus to follow us. Hey, Jesus, can you come on my day with me, and can you kind of follow me around and work things out? Can you like answer this prayer and that prayer? And hey, she's really cute. Can you set a date up with her? I mean, I think some teenagers are like, oh, I'm just going to take Jesus with me to school. So in our Western culture, we do a lot of taking Jesus with us and expecting him to follow us rather than us following Jesus. And I think this is a big problem that we face here in our Western American culture. I think that's one of the reasons that the Gallup polls say nationwide that 76% of Americans click the box and say, hey, yeah, I'm a Christian, which is fascinating because a lot of independent surveys, when they dig in and say, okay, how many people are actually following the ways of Jesus, their number is very different. They list, and don't ask me how they figured this out. I don't know all the ins and outs, but they say 8% of people are actually following Jesus. I mean, think about it. That's a big chasm, right? So, you got 76% of people that say, yep, I'm Christian, I'm checking the box. Less than 10% actually following after Jesus. Now, that's a Western American problem. I mean, this idea would have been very, very foreign to Jesus. All right, this would have been an alien concept to him because, see, all throughout the Gospels, all throughout the New Testament, Jesus continued to kind of identify, really, there are only 2 kinds of people. In fact, he says it even right here. He, in one of his phrases we read earlier, he said, whoever wants to be my disciple. He opens it up to everybody. He says, they must deny themselves and take up their cross. And then here's our phrase, and just follow me. So in essence, he's saying you have the disciples, which are those who are following, and then you have the crowds, which are those that are gathering. And when you think about the disciples, think about this. Don't just think about like the 12, like Peter, James, Matthew. That's a subgroup of disciples. That's like Jesus' apostles. Jesus had hundreds. He had even thousands of disciples in Galilee. Think about this. Male disciples, female disciples. Yeah, that was unheard of, by the way, in the first century. All right? I mean, as far as we know, there is no other rabbi on record that had female disciples. I mean, Jesus was like way ahead of the curve on this. So we see this sharp divide between those that are disciples and those that are in the crowds. In fact, Mark and some of the other gospel writers even use this as a literary device to kind of beg the question, which group are you in? Are you in the crowd with the follower, with the gatherers, or are you in the smaller group of disciples? And I think that's a question that's still relevant for us today. In fact, for us here, even right now, those of us tuning in, where would you put yourself? Would you say I'm a little more of a Christian? Or would I put myself in the followers of Jesus category? And some of us are going, bro, I don't even know how to answer that. Or I don't even know how to get started on that. That's totally cool. You're going to have the chance. We're going to help you actually take steps at your own pace. But I think this is a good question to ask. In fact, Dallas Willard, again, this guru of the spiritual life over the last century, he put it this way. He said, the greatest issue facing the world today with all of its heartbreaking needs. I mean, think about this for a moment. Just think how amazing that starting statement is. I mean, think of all the things that are going wrong in our world right now. I mean, think of all the fracturedness, all the brokenness. I mean, think of how all the things that are cracked in our world, the political system, racial injustice. I mean, the widening gap between those that have and those that don't. I mean, everything. He says the greatest issue facing the world today with all of its heartbreaking needs is whether those who by profession or culture are identified as Christians will become disciples. Whether they'll become students, apprentices, practitioners of Jesus Christ, steadily learning from him how to live the life of the kingdom of heaven into every corner of human existence. So again, Jesus isn't looking for converts to Christianity. He's actually inviting people to apprentice in what it means to be a part of the kingdom of God. Now, the second thing I want us to notice is that the invitation is open to anybody. I mean, he says, whoever wants to be my disciple. I mean, we heard earlier that apprenticing with the rabbi, I mean, this was like for the best of the best of the best, right? But here we have rockstar Jesus, right? Rockstar Rabbi Jesus, and he's out there in front of a crowd, and he is saying, whoever wants to be my disciple. I mean, this was unheard of. And notice who Jesus was calling. Doesn't matter where you're from or where you're not from. Doesn't matter what you've done or what you've not done. I mean, listen, these were not the best of the best, which again, all of this has huge implications for you and me in terms of what it means to understand what it means to be a follower. So back to these stories that we looked at a few minutes ago. We find Jesus walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he comes across Peter and Andrew. And what are they doing? They're fishermen, right? And he says to them, come and follow me. But if they're fishermen, that means that they're not the best of the best. I mean, at some point, they decided to take up the family trade, but it says all at once, they dropped their nets and they followed him. And then Jesus comes across James and John, who are fishing with their father Zebedee, which again, if they're fishing with their father Zebedee, that means they've taken up the family business. It means they're not the best of the best. I mean, how old are these guys? 15, 18, maybe 20? I mean, these are not old guys. I mean, Jesus chooses them because he wants us to see that everybody's included in his movement. The rich, the poor, men, women, the educated, the uneducated. I mean, this is a movement of anybody's. This is like the JV. This is like the B team right here. And yet he calls them to be his disciples, and they change the course of human history. So back to this moment where we find Peter out in a boat. Jesus comes walking across the water, and he's in this boat full of anybody's, the JV team, a bunch of people who were not the best of the best. And Peter says, he looks at Jesus and he says, hey, Jesus, he says, if that's you, then tell me to come out to you on the water. Now, have you ever wondered why this was Peter's first response right here? I mean, why was his very first response, hey, Jesus, tell me to come out to you? You know why? It's because he was a disciple. He'd oriented his whole life around his rabbi. He'd oriented his whole existence. He devoted himself to a rabbi, Jesus, and trying to do what his rabbi was doing. And he sees his rabbi walking on the water, and he says, hey, I want to be just like you. And so Peter, I don't know how this went. I mean, I picture Peter like putting one leg over the side of the boat and kind of like testing it out a little bit. Like, Jesus, I don't know how this is going to go. And he's like, man, this is working. And slowly like swinging his other leg over, like holding on to the side of the boat. And all of a sudden he's like, look, guys, look, I'm like doing it. He's like, I'm doing what my rabbi's doing. And he literally starts walking toward his rabbi. And then all of a sudden he sees the wind, he sees the waves. And it says immediately he begins to sink. And Jesus looks at him and says, Peter, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And again, this is so fascinating right here. See, I always assumed that Peter doubted Jesus. But Jesus wasn't the one sinking right here. Who did Peter doubt? He actually doubted himself. He actually loses faith in himself that he can actually be like his rabbi. See, all my life, I've heard people talking about believing in God. But I think what Jesus is showing us is that God actually believes in you. He believes in me. He believes in us. So today, we're going to take our first step of following. In fact, as we start this journey, I want you to go ahead and take out this bag that you received when you came in. And if you're tuning on the line, just hit pause for a moment. Go grab some food, grab something to drink. Anything will do. Cracker bread, some kind of beverage. God knows your heart on this. You can use whatever's available. This bag right here actually communicates something to us. In fact, we often look at this and say, hey, this has to do with our belief in God, but I think part of what is in this bag represents God's belief in you, God's belief in us. In fact, Jesus invited his followers to share this meal. Some call it the Eucharist, the Mass, the Lord's Supper, communion. Jesus says, I want you to do this to remember me. I want you to do this to remember me. But I think he also did it to say, hey, I want you to do this so you can remember that I actually believe in you. In fact, I want to pray for us before we do anything else with this. God, thank you for just this moment. Thank you for the invitation to follow, to apprentice after you. So many times we're like, I don't know if I'm up for it. I don't know if I have what it takes, Jesus. But I just pray that you'd help us to see right now that you actually believe in us. God, would you actually show us that you believe that we can actually be with you, we can become more like you, and we can actually do what you do. And God, in this moment, would you just remind us of what you did for us and what you call us to. Thank you for including us. Amen. So again, some call this the Eucharist, some call the Mass, the communion, the Lord's Supper. It's all in one the same. You might be wondering, okay, can I do this? I'm not a member of this church. Here at Crosspoint, we have open communion, so this is available to everyone. In fact, Jesus didn't really give any instructions on this about who should take it and all that. I mean, there's some indirect references, but if you feel like this honors Jesus and you're like, hey, I'm going to do this to just say, hey, Jesus, I want more of you, and I'm moving in your direction, then you think that will help you, then I think you should do that. This will help you in your journey. And this is one of the things he gave us to connect with him. And so, I want you to go ahead and take out the crackers. Jesus, when he was meeting with his team, he tried to help them understand what he was here for. And he said, he took some common bread. I mean, this is what you'd have at Steak and Shake, or if you were eating some soup. He said, every time you eat this bread, I want you to remember my body, which was broken for you, that I actually came and did something on your behalf for you. But I also think it was a reminder that because he did this for us, it was actually because of his belief in us. And so he said, I want you to eat to remember me. So let's do that. Then you can take out a little vial of juice take the cap off. And this represents the cup. There's a cup on the table, and he said, hey, every time you do this, I want you to remember me. He's, again, asking us to follow him in this, to do something to commemorate. He said, this represents the blood that was shed for the forgiveness of sins for many. And we go, oh, what do you mean many? I mean, I thought this was for everyone. Well, it is, but he just knew that only some would receive it. And so he said, I did this for you so you could be reconciled to your Heavenly Father, but I think it was also an expression of him saying, I believe in you. And so if you want to connect with that and that reality for your life, then go ahead and drink. It's our first following in the journey. Let me tell you something. The journey has begun. Jesus invites us. He says, I want to take you deeper. You guys ready to go deeper? All right, let's go deeper. I think he wants to take us there. Good things lie ahead.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Take a moment to follow our podcast on your preferred platform, and be sure to download our app to stay informed on everything happening here at Crosspoint. And if you like what you heard today, don't hesitate to share it with a friend that might need to hear it too.